President of the Colorado Motor Vehicle Dealer Board. Today's date is November 17th, 2020, and the time is 9:01 a.m. I will be presiding over this emergency rulemaking hearing in accordance with Section 24.4.1036A of the Colorado Revised Statutes. These proceedings are being recorded as is standard practice of the board. Notice of this emergency rulemaking meeting was announced via an agenda notice issued on November 10th, 2020. As noticed in the agenda, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and emergency, this meeting is being held virtually using Cisco WebEx and is accessible to the public. At this time, I request that the board members, the executive secretary, and the representative from the Colorado Attorney General's office identify themselves for the record, starting with the board members. I'll just go down the list and just let us know if you're here. Ms. Baumgart?
I'm here.
Thank you. Ms. Behrens?
Yes, Mr. Litton, I'm here.
Thank you. Did Mr. Flower join? Does not look like Mr. Flower is on. Ms. Bode?
I am here.
Thank you, Ms. Bode. Did Mr. Porter join? See Mr. Porter. Mr. Shaughnessy?
I'm here.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh is not here today. And Mr. Whithelm?
Yes, Mr. Whithelm is here.
Thank you, Mr. Whithelm. And then Mr. Jones from the Attorney General's office. Mr. Jones, I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Bradford Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office here to advise the board during the rulemaking process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And the Executive Secretary?
Yes, sir, I am here.
Thank you, Ms. Rouse. I've determined that a quorum of the board is present, so it is possible to proceed. Specifically, during this emergency rulemaking hearing, the board will consider the repeal of two current emergency rules that the board promulgated on August 5th, 2020. Motor Vehicle Rule number 4420-102-22-COVID and Power Sports Vehicle Rule number 4420-402-17-COVID. Please mute your microphone.
So just no idea where it is.
The board will also consider the promulgation and adoption of the following emergency rules. Motor Vehicle Rule 4420-102-22-COVID dial and Power Sports Vehicle Rule 4420-402-17-COVID dial. At this time, I'd like to call for a motion to open the hearing to consider the repeal of the two current emergency rules and the promulgation of two new proposed emergency rules related both to 1 CCR 205-1 regarding motor vehicles and to 1 CCR 205-2 regarding power sports vehicles. Is there a motion to open the emergency rulemaking hearing?
This is Ramona Bode. I'll make a motion to open the emergency hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Bode. Do we have a second?
Ms. Behrens, I'll second it.
Thank you, Ms. Behrens. We have a motion by Ms. Bode and a second by Ms. Behrens. Any further discussion?
This is Mrs. Bode. I just have a couple questions about this. Am I allowed to ask a couple questions, Mr. President?
Let's vote to open the meeting first, and then we can
Okay.
a portion for questions.
Okay.
So we have a motion from Ms. Bode and a second by Ms. Behrens. Ms. Baumgart?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
And Mr. Whithelm?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Due to the emergency nature of these proposed emergency rules, this hearing will proceed in accordance with Section 24.4.1036A CRS and is not subject to the requirements under subsection 3 and 4 of that statutory provision. At this time, I will turn the hearing over to Chris Rouse, Executive Secretary to the Board and the Director of the Auto Industry Division, to provide an overview and background for the emergency rules. Ms. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, board members, staff, and guests. This rulemaking meeting and hearing is to consider the adoption of two emergency rules, 4420-102-22 COVID dial and 4420-402-17 COVID dial. Since this meeting is being held virtually, I would ask everyone to mute their microphones unless they're speaking or testifying in order to reduce the background noise. The COVID-19 pandemic continues, and the need for emergency rules surrounding operations during this pandemic remains. In August, this board promulgated 2 emergency rules to replace the expired emergency rules that they promulgated in April of 2020. Emergency rules are only valid for 120 days. The rules promulgated on August 5th, 2020 will expire on December 3rd. We're going to have this hearing to repeal the emergency rules promulgated on August 5th, 2020, and replace them with 2 updated emergency rules. Mr. Jones has drafted 2 new versions of the emergency rules for your consideration today. There have been numerous executive orders and public health orders over the past few months. I will save you the trouble of me reciting each of them. However, I do need to create the record by stating the following. In an effort to continue to enable motor vehicle dealers, used motor vehicle dealers, power sports dealers, and used power sports dealers to continue retail sales and operations during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in accordance with Executive Order D 2020-235, dated October 30th of 2020, Executive Order D 2020-245, dated November 9th of 2020, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's Public Health Order 20-36, dated November 2nd, 2020, and other guidance issued by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the Centers for Disease Control, and local counties and municipalities, it's necessary to engage in rulemaking activities and to adopt the proposed emergency regulation 4420-102-22 COVID dial and regulation 4420-402-17 COVID dial. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Rouse. Also wanted to note for the record, looks like Mr. Flower has joined the call. Do the board members have any questions for Ms. Rouse before we proceed?
Mr. President, before we start, Mr. Flower, this is Mr. Jones. If you could just confirm that you're here through your audio.
I'm here.
All right. Thank you, Mr.
Sorry.
Did any board members have questions for Mrs. Rouse?
Well, this is Ramona Bode. Hi, Miss Rouse.
Good morning, Ms. Bode.
I have a couple questions about this. So does this mean in this change that test drives can no longer happen?
No, ma'am. The only thing that's changing in these is we're updating the most recent public health orders and the most recent executive orders and incorporating the dial system that the governor's office has on their dashboard.
So customers can still, because I guess I'm not clear on that no touch. Does that mean they can still test drive and still come in and fill out their paperwork and things like that?
Yeah, and all the things that we've been doing in the past since the pandemic has started will remain in place. We're just updating the verbiage in your regulations.
Perfect. Okay, that's my question.
Ms. Bode, this is Mr. Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office. That is correct. The only exception to that would be if the local jurisdiction that the dealership is located has more stringent restrictions because of what's going on with the pandemic. And I'll just take this opportunity to kind of expand on it. The reason that this needs to be updated is Governor Polis introduced what's called the dial framework, and that was included in the executive order and the public health order. And there's different levels depending on where counties and or municipalities or regions are at. And so that's why there is a necessary need for flexibility. Fortunately, based on how Ms. Rouse and the board have crafted the previous versions of the rules, it's very easy to kind of just incorporate these. But it is very important for all dealers, whether they're motor vehicles or power sports, to be familiar with the specific local public health orders as well. just because that is what the state is trying to encourage local counties and municipalities to do based on the numbers of positive within their jurisdiction.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't lose the test drive or being able to touch and feel the car, because with new cars, it would be easy. But with used cars, people want to look at them, see the condition, you know, those kind of things. And we sanitize after they've been in them. And
I think it's the board itself is not imposing any additional restrictions on that. It's just really dependent on what the public health entities are putting out.
well, then you guys answered all my questions. I don't have any more.
Thank you, Ms. Bode. Is there any other questions from board members? All right, hearing none, we'll move on. If there's anyone from the public who wishes to testify, please speak up. Make sure to state your full name and the name of the organization, if any, that you are appearing on behalf of. Please attempt to limit your comments to 5 minutes. Does anyone wish to speak?
Would this be speaking on one's criminal history?
This is just
No,
sorry, Mr. Jones.
This is Mr. Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office. No, this is just with respect to the rulemaking. The standard background investigation portion of the board meeting will occur after the conclusion of the rulemaking.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? Okay, hearing none. At this time, I'd like to call for a motion to close the public comment phase of the hearing to consider the repeal of the two current the two current emergency rules and the promulgation of the two new proposed emergency rules related both to 1 CCR 205-1 regarding motor vehicles and to 1 CCR 205-2 regarding power sports vehicles. Is there a motion to close the public comment phase of the rulemaking hearing?
I would motion to close the public comment section of the rulemaking.
Thank you. We have a motion by Mr. Flower.
I would
I'll second.
second.
Sorry, is that Ms. Behrens? Is that a second?
Thank you, Mr. Linton.
Thank you. Second by Ms. Behrens.
I would second that motion.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor, Ms. Baumgart?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Bode.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy.
Yes.
And Mr. Whithelm?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. The public comment phase of the rulemaking hearing is now closed. No further comments from the public or the division will be allowed without explicit recognition by the chair of this hearing. The board will now begin the deliberation phase of this emergency rulemaking hearing. The deliberation phase is open to the public, but only board members and the Attorney General representative are permitted to participate unless the chair authorizes someone else to speak. Since there are two current emergency rules and two proposed emergency rules, each rule will have to be voted on separately. Additionally, due to the emergency nature of these rules, the board must also vote to approve the statement of justification for each of the two proposed emergency rules in accordance with Section 24-4-103-6A. Before I call for motions on these emergency rules, do any of the board members have any comments on the two current emergency rules and or the two proposed new emergency rules before we begin? All right, hearing none, we will move forward to the motions. Do I have a motion to repeal current emergency regulation 4420-102-22-COVID previously promulgated on August 5th, 2020?
This is Mr. Whithelm, so moved.
Motion by Mr. Whithelm. Do we have a second?
It's Mr. Shaughnessy, I'll second.
And a second by Mr. Shaughnessy. Any further discussion? All in favor, Ms. Baumgart?
Yes.
Ms. Behrens?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Ms. Bode?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Next one, do I have a motion to repeal current emergency regulation 4420-402-17-COVID previously promulgated on August 5th, 2020?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Flower. Do a second?
I'll second. This is Mrs. Bode.
Thank you. A second by Ms. Bode. Any further discussion? All in favor, Ms. Baumgart?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Behrens?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Whithelm?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. So next we have to adopt the new rules. Do I have a motion to adopt the proposed emergency regulation 4420-102-22-COVID dial and to authorize me as the president of the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board to sign the statement of emergency justification and adoption concerning emergency regulation 4420-102-22-COVID dial? Is there a motion to adopt?
This is Carrie Baumgart. I'll move. So moved.
We have a motion from Ms. Baumgart. Do we have a second?
This is Mrs. Bode. I'll second.
And a second by Ms. Bode. Any further discussion? All in favor, Ms. Behrens?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Flower.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy.
Yes.
Thank you, and Mr. Woodhelm.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. And our last one, do I have a motion to adopt the proposed emergency regulation 4420-402-17-COVID dial and authorize me as the president of the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board to sign the statement of emergency justification and adoption concerning emergency regulation 4420-402-17-COVID dial? Is there a motion to adopt?
So moved. This is Mrs. Bode.
We have a motion by Ms. Bode. Do we have a second?
This is Mr. Whithelm. I'll second.
Thank you. A second by Mr. Whithelm. Any further discussion? All in favor, Ms. Baumgart?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Behrens?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, members of the board. Mr. Jones, do you have anything to add before we proceed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. So just to let everyone know, the previous versions of these rules that were just repealed will be repealed immediately, and that will be reflected and submitted to the Secretary of State's office. And then the emergency rules 4420, 102, Bren 22, COVID dial and 4420, 402, 17 COVID dial will immediately go into effect for a period of 120 days unless amended or repealed before that period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. We've reached the conclusion of this emergency rulemaking hearing. I'd like to thank the board members and everyone else who has participated in the process today. At this time, I'd like to call for a motion to close the hearing. Is there a motion to close the rulemaking hearing?
This is Mrs. Bode.
I believe there was a motion by Ms. Bode to close the hearing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And a second?
I'll make a motion to second that.
Thank you, Ms. Behrens. Any further discussion? All in favor, Ms. Baumgart?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Woodhelm?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. I declare this rulemaking hearing closed. And now we will proceed to the normally scheduled November board meeting.